Good evening, dear friends, and a very warm welcome to each and every one of you. Wherever you're listening from tonight, maybe tucked under the blankets in bed, curled up in your favorite quiet corner of the house, or sitting somewhere peaceful while the rest of the world slowly fades away, I'm so happy you're here with me. Take a slow, gentle breath in. Let your shoulders soften and drop. Maybe pull the blanket or duvet up just a little higher, and allow the day to quietly slip away from you. London fog lay thick upon the city that autumn evening. At 221 B Baker Street, Holmes sat idle, craving challenge. Then came the urgent knock at the door. Sir Reginald Thorne found dead at Piccadilly Circus, strangled in his locked hansom cab, with no signs of entry or struggle. Scotland Yard saw a tragic accident or perhaps suicide, but Holmes saw a link, a peculiar bruise upon the neck, shaped like a twisted chain link, one link in a chain that would bind a killer. The game is afoot. Chapter 1. The First Link. I set down these events as they occurred in that chill autumn of 1895, when the thick fog of London wrapped the city like a shroud, carrying the sharp smell of coal smoke and the dank rot of Thames mud into every street and alley. At 221 B Baker Street, Sherlock Holmes had fallen into one of his dark, restless moods. He paced before the coal fire, the flames crackling warmly against the bitter cold that seeped through the window frames. His Stradivarius violin lay untouched on the table among scattered chemical apparatus and the faint carbolic scent of his latest experiment. The room was heavy with the strong tobacco he kept in his Persian slipper, mingling with the damp newspaper I had brought in earlier, its texture rough and sodden under my fingers. Mrs. Hudson had just ascended the 17 steps with a tray of hot tea, its steam rising in comforting curls and cutting the chill, when a sharp, urgent knock echoed from below. Holmes paused mid-stride, his eyes gleaming with that peculiar light of anticipation. He drew upon his pipe thoughtfully, the smooth stem cool against his lips. "Enter," he called. The door opened to reveal Inspector Lestrade, his ulster coat glistening with fog damp, coal dust clinging to the rough tweed. His boots left dark, muddy prints on our carpet, the texture gritty like the cold cobblestones outside. Big Ben tolled distantly through the mist, a low, mournful sound. "Mr. Holmes, Dr. Watson," Lestrade said, voice roughened by the night air. "We've a most peculiar death at Piccadilly Circus. Sir Reginald Thorne, the wealthy importer, found strangled in his own locked hansom cab. No sign of entry or exit. Scotland Yard is calling it possible suicide or accident, but the circumstances defy reason." I poured Lestrade a cup of bitter coffee, its sharp taste lingering on my tongue as I listened. Holmes steepled his fingers beneath his chin. "Details, Lestrade! Data, data, data! I can make no bricks without clay." The inspector sat heavily in the smooth leather armchair, fog horns moaning faintly from the river beyond. Thorne left his Mayfair Club at 8:30. The cabby heard a sudden gasp, stopped near the circus fountain. When he opened the door, Thorne was slumped, neck marked with a deep, twisted bruise, like a chain pulled tight. Doors were locked from inside. Witnesses in the fog spoke of a ghostly figure vanishing into the mist, but no one saw an actual person approach or leave the cab. The room seemed to grow colder as the fog pressed harder against the glass panes. Holmes paced rapidly before the fire, footsteps soft on the rug. "The game is afoot, Watson. We go at once to the scene." We descended the stairs, hailed a hansom in the gaslit street, and rattled off through the fog. The cab's wheels clattered over cold cobblestones. The leather seats chilled against my back, while the smell of Thames mud and wet horse rose around us. Piccadilly Circus appeared through the swirling mist, gas lamps flickering like dying stars. Constables held lanterns, their warm glow cutting the bitter night. Sir Reginald's body still lay inside the cab, face frozen in agony, neck bearing that strange, metallic twisted bruise. Holmes bent close, his magnifying glass cold in my palm as I handed it over. The rain began to patter softly on the cab roof. "The first link, Watson," he murmured. "Observe this bruise, shaped precisely like a single forged chain link, with tiny, embedded fibres of hemp. Not the fray of ordinary rope, but something heavier, industrial, perhaps from a warehouse hoist or ship's chain." I noticed the rough tweed of the victim's overcoat stained with coal dust, and caught the faint, unexpected whiff of gunpowder clinging to the fabric. Holmes straightened. "The forge. Such a mark demands even mechanical pressure, not the frantic grip of hands in struggle. This suggests a device, not direct violence." He drew a thoughtful parallel. "I recall the case of the engineer's thumb. There, a hydraulic press left clean, unmistakable impressions on flesh and bone. The victim believed it an industrial accident, yet the metal's bite revealed deliberate malice. The counterfeiter's machine betrayed them. Here, likewise, the bruise is no random mark, but evidence of calculated murder disguised as mystery or ghost. Therefore," Holmes continued, voice low against the crackling brazier nearby, "Thorne was slain by human hand, not spectral force. The link binds tight already, Watson. Did you see it form? The connection seems invisible. Can you see it now?" We proceeded to Sir Reginald's Mayfair residence, the hansom's journey slow through the fog. Lady Eleanor Thorne received us in the warm drawing-room, a silk gown smooth beneath trembling hands, the air thick with lingering tobacco from her husband's pipe. "He left for the club at 8, she whispered, the voice trembling like distant footsteps on stairs. He had rivals. Mr. Hargrove, his business partner, quarrelled bitterly over recent shipments from the East." Holmes's gaze fell upon a telegram on the mantel, its paper slightly damp from the fog. Nearby lounged the nephew, Arthur Thorne, boots worn and scuffed, reeking faintly of cheap brandy. "Uncle was kind with money," he said, accepting a glass we offered, the sweet liquor warm on his breath. "But my debts have mounted." Holmes noted a speck of reddish clay mud on Arthur's cuff. "You have been near a foundry recently?" he asked quietly. Arthur paled as rain drummed against the window. Later, back at 221B, the coal fire roared warmly, its crackle mingling with Holmes absently plucking the violin strings. I reflected on the evening, the biting cold of the temporary morgue tent, the gunpowder scent, the locked cab. Holmes spoke again. "Another link. The cab's interior scratches suggest a struggle, yet none mar the exterior paint. The chain must have been introduced through the small vent above the door, then pulled from outside." He forged the connection further, recalling the Musgrave ritual. Hidden mechanisms in ancient stone walls had concealed both treasure and deadly traps. The butler's greed led to his own entrapment by a clever device. "Here too," Holmes said, "a mechanism feigns impossibility. Thus not suicide nor ghost, but murder most ingenious." Holmes saw 3 links already: bruise shape, vent scratches, foundry mud. How many did you spot, dear reader? Before I explain further, what chain would you build from these observations? The fog pressed thicker outside. Big Ben tolling midnight. Holmes reached once more for his Persian slipper, the comforting aroma of tobacco filling the room. Chapter 2. Forging Connections. The fog of London refused to lift the following morning, hanging low and heavy like wet wool over the rooftops. At 221B Baker Street, the coal fire burned steadily. Its crackle, a steady heartbeat against the muffled clatter of hansom cabs outside. The air carried the familiar mix of strong tobacco from Holmes's pipe, the faint carbolic residue of yesterday's chemical traces, and the damp, earthy smell that always followed the morning newspaper I had left unfolded on the table. I sipped hot tea, its warmth spreading through my chest and countering the bitter chill that seeped through the window frames. Holmes stood by the mantel, steepled fingers under his chin, studying the scrap of reddish clay I had carefully preserved from Arthur Thorne's cuff. "We begin forging connections today, Watson," he said quietly. "Mud, telegram, chain fibers. Each is a link. Today we test where they lead." He reached for his ulster and deerstalker. The game continues. Our first destination was Victor Hargrove's warehouse near the Whitechapel docks. The hansom rattled over uneven cobblestones, wheels splashing through shallow puddles that reflected the sickly yellow of gas lamps still burning in mid-morning. The smell of Thames mud grew stronger as we neared the river, mingled now with the sharp tang of coal smoke pouring from factory chimneys. Inside the warehouse, the air was thick with the scent of oiled leather from stacked crates, and the metallic bite of chain hoists hanging overhead. Mr. Hargrove received us in his cramped office, a burly man in rough tweed whose hands were stained with grease. The texture of his coat was coarse under the gaslight. "Sir Reginald and I had our differences," he admitted, voice rough like gravel. "He wanted to expand into Chinese silks. I preferred safer Indian cotton. We argued the night before last, but I was here all evening, inventorying stock." He gestured to a ledger open on the desk. Holmes bent to examine a length of heavy chain coiled in the corner. Its links were cold and smooth to the touch, the exact gauge that had left the twisted impression on Sir Reginald's neck. "This hoist," Holmes murmured, "recently missing one link." Hargrove stiffened. "Normal wear, chains break." But I noticed coal dust thick on his boots, identical in shade to that on the dead man's tweed, and the listener may already sense the connection. "Watson missed it at first, did you?" We took tea at a small public house nearby, the wooden benches rough beneath us, the sweet burn of brandy cutting through the damp fog that drifted in every time the door opened. Holmes spoke little, eyes distant, as though mentally linking one observation to the next. Our next call was to Silas Blackwood's counting house in the city. The streets were louder here. Footsteps on wet pavement, distant shouts of newsboys, the low toll of Big Ben filtering through the mist. Blackwood's office smelled of old ledgers, ink, and the faint sweetness of pipe tobacco. He was thinner than Hargrove, sharp-featured, and offered us bitter coffee that left an acrid taste on the tongue. "Thorne stole clients from me," he said flatly. "But murder? Absurd. I was dining at Simpson's that evening, 20 witnesses." He produced a crumpled telegram receipt as proof. Holmes studied it closely, noting the paper was slightly damp, odd for an indoor document. On the desk lay a folded newspaper open to an article about the Ghost of Piccadilly, with underlined passages about the family curse. You follow such tales? Holmes asked mildly. Blackwood gave a short laugh. Superstition sells papers. Thorne himself believed in that old chain ghost nonsense. His ancestor supposedly strangled by his own heirloom during a duel. The temperature in the room seemed to drop as fog pressed against the window. Another link, Holmes whispered to me. The curse used as convenient cover. The connection seems invisible. Can you see it forming? And by early afternoon, we reached Arthur Thorne's lodgings in a narrow Soho street. Rain had begun again, drumming steadily on slate roofs. Arthur answered the door himself, unshaven, reeking of stale tobacco and the sweet sharp remnant of last night's brandy. His smooth briar pipe lay cold on the mantel. Uncle was going to settle my debts, he muttered, but he kept putting it off. Holmes's gaze flicked to the floorboards. Another small smear of reddish clay, the same foundry shade as before. You frequent Whitechapel foundries? Holmes asked. Arthur flushed. Aye, walk that way sometimes, clears the head. A half-burned letter in the grate caught Holmes's eye. Debts owed to Hargrove personally. The chain of obligation was growing clearer. Our final visit of the day was to Eliza Croft, the dismissed housemaid, in a cramped Stepney tenement, and the stairs creaked under our weight, the narrow hallway thick with coal smoke from 100 small fires. She opened the door cautiously, apron rough and patched, hands red and calloused like worn leather. Master Thorne turned me out without reference, she said bitterly. Said I talked too much about his temper. Around her neck hung a simple locket on a thin chain, its central link shaped exactly like the mark on Sir Reginald's throat. Family heirloom? Holmes inquired gently. She touched it protectively. My father's. But I was home all evening. My sister will swear to it. Yet her boots bore traces of Thames mud, the kind that clings near the docks where Hargrove's shipments arrived. Back in the hansom, rain lashing the side curtains, the cold leather seat sticking slightly to my coat, Holmes spoke at last. Links are forging, Watson. Mud from foundries and riverbanks, chains industrial and personal, telegrams that appear and disappear, gunpowder sent where no firearm was fired. The chain takes shape. Business, inheritance, old grudges, mechanical cunning. He leaned back, eyes gleaming in the dim interior. Holmes saw 4 potential links today. Clay mud, chain hoist, forged telegram receipt, family curse tales. How many did you spot, dear reader? Before the next step, what chain would you build from these scattered observations? The foghorns groaned again from the river as we approached Baker Street. The first day's work was done, but the chain was only beginning to tighten. Chapter 3. The Chain Grows. As I continue this faithful record of the Piccadilly ghost affair, yet I cannot help but marvel at how swiftly the fog of mystery began to thin under Holmes's relentless scrutiny, even as the literal fog of London grew denser and more suffocating on that second full day of our investigation. The coal fire at 221B Baker Street roared steadily, its warm crackle a welcome contrast to the bitter damp that clung to our coats, and left the scent of wet wool and coal smoke hanging in the air. We had taken an early breakfast of strong tea and toast. The tea's bitter warmth lingered on my tongue, as Holmes studied once more the small fibre he had plucked from the cab's vent the previous evening. "Today we return to the scene itself, Watson," he announced, tucking the fibre carefully into an envelope. "The first links were forged from observation. Now we must see if the chain will bear greater weight." He donned his ulster, the rough tweed rasping softly, and we descended the 17 steps into the chill morning. The hansom cab rattled us back toward Piccadilly Circus, wheels clattering over uneven cobblestones slick with overnight rain. The foghorns on the Thames moaned like distant mourners, and the smell of Thames mud rose thickly whenever we passed an open drain. Gas lamps still burned feebly in the gloom, their light diffusing into pale halos. When we reached the circus, the police cordon remained, though the body had long since been removed to the morgue. The abandoned hansom stood under a tarpaulin, rain pattering steadily on its canvas roof. Holmes lifted the flap and stepped inside, the leather seats cold and faintly sticky to the touch. He crouched near the small ventilation slat above the door, the very opening I had dismissed as insignificant the night before. "Here, Watson," he said, voice low against the drumming rain. "The slat is bent outward by the fraction of an inch, and observe these tiny hemp fibres caught in the metal edge, identical to those embedded in the bruise." He held the magnifying glass steady, the lens cold in my hand as I passed it back. "The link. These fibres carry a faint residue of gunpowder." I leaned closer, catching the acrid whiff myself. Holmes continued forging the connection. "The forge, gunpowder in minute quantity, suggests a small charge. Enough to propel or tension a chain through the vent with sudden force, then retract it before the cab stopped. The locked doors and absent weapon become explicable. In the ghost was mechanical." He paused, eyes gleaming in that peculiar light. "I am reminded of the speckled band affair. There a deadly mechanism, a venomous swamp adder, was passed through a dummy bell-pull vent by night. The doctor believed his stepdaughter died of natural terror or snakebite chance. Yet the saucer of milk, the whistle, and the bell-pull's false nature forged an unbreakable chain of human design. Here, likewise, the vent, the gunpowder trace, the precise bruise, all point to a device, not apparition. The chain grows, Watson. The link was there, plain to see. Did you forge it before Holmes revealed the mechanism?" We searched the floor of the cab more thoroughly. Beneath the seat, my friend's long fingers discovered a crumpled fragment of telegram paper, half-soaked but still legible. "Meet at Circus H." The texture was smooth, the ink recent and slightly smudged by damp. "H for Hargrove?" I ventured. Holmes nodded slowly. "Or another, but the timing is suggestive." Outside we walked the nearby alleys, where the shadowy figure had reportedly vanished. Mud squelched under our boots, cold, clinging, and streaked with the same reddish clay we had seen on Arthur Thorne's cuff and Hargrove's warehouse floor. Holmes knelt and scraped a sample into a vial. "Thames mud near the docks, mixed with foundry clay. Our suspects tread the same paths." The cold bit deeper as we made our way to the temporary morgue tent nearby. Inside, the air was sharp with carbolic and the underlying chill of death. Sir Reginald lay under a sheet. Holmes drew it back just enough to examine the neck once more. In better light, the bruise showed faint parallel lines, consistent with chain links. And on the dead man's forearm, I now noticed a small faded tattoo. A coiled chain, the old Thorne family crest. "Heritage," Holmes murmured. "Motive may lie in legacy as much as commerce." Back at 221B that afternoon, the fire burned hotter, its warmth welcome against our chilled faces. Holmes paced before the hearth, violin in hand, plucking a few absent notes that hung in the tobacco-scented air. "We have mud-linking foundry, docks and cab, gunpowder from warehouse stock, telegram fragment, vent mechanism, family curse tales used as smokescreen. The chain grows stronger, Watson. Logic binds what superstition would unravel." He turned to me with sudden intensity. Before I lay out the next step, what does this growing chain of evidence tell you? Oh, dear reader, the connection once seemed invisible. Can you see it tightening now? Holmes has spotted 5 distinct links so far. Vent fibres, gunpowder, telegram scrap matching mud, tattooed crest. How many did you recognize before this chapter closed? Outside, Big Ben told 3. Its deep note muffled by the ever-present fog. Holmes set the violin aside and reached once more for his Persian slipper, drawing comfort from the strong tobacco as he prepared for the trials ahead. Chapter 4. Testing the Links. By the 3rd morning of our investigation into the Piccadilly ghost affair, the fog had thinned just enough to let pale sunlight filter through, though the air remained heavy with coal smoke and the ever-present damp of London streets. At 221B Baker Street, the coal fire snapped and popped, sending a welcome warmth against the chill that still clung to our clothes from the previous day's excursions. Holmes had risen early. I found him standing by the window, pipe in hand, the strong tobacco mingling with the faint carbolic scent that lingered from his chemical bench. He turned as I entered, eyes bright with purpose. "Today, Watson, we test the links we have forged," he said. "Some will hold firm under strain, others will shatter like brittle iron. Only the true chain will remain." He set down his pipe and reached for his ulster. "We begin at once." Our first stop was Sir Reginald Thorne's club in Mayfair, a quiet establishment of dark panelling and leather armchairs that smelled faintly of old cigars and polished wood. The porter admitted us after Holmes produced his card, as several members who had dined with Hargrove on the night of the murder were still present over late breakfast. One elderly gentleman, sipping bitter coffee, recalled Hargrove leaving the smoking room unusually early, around 7:30, claiming a sudden headache. Another added that Hargrove had seemed preoccupied, staring into the fire rather than joining the conversation. Holmes noted their words carefully, the smooth leather of the chair creaking beneath him. "Alibi weakened," he murmured to me as we left. "A link begins to bend." Next we drove to Silas Blackwood's counting house once more. The cab jolted over wet cobblestones, rain beginning to fall again in a fine cold mist. Blackwood greeted us with forced civility, offering seats in his office where the gaslight flickered against shelves of ledgers. He produced the telegram receipt again, insisting it proved his presence at Simpson's. Holmes examined the paper closely under his lens. The ink showed slight running at one edge, inconsistent with indoor handling. This was exposed to damp after writing, Holmes observed quietly. "Not sent from a dry office." Blackwood paled. When pressed about his rivalry with Thorne, he admitted undercutting prices, but denied any violent intent. The forged-appearing telegram cracked his alibi like thin ice. A weak link shattered. We pressed on to Arthur Thorne's Soho lodgings. The narrow street was alive with the clatter of costermongers' barrows and the sharp cries of street sellers. Arthur answered the door in shirt-sleeves, the sweet, sharp reek of brandy still on his breath, despite the early hour. The Holmes confronted him directly with the reddish clay found both in the cab and on his boots. Arthur stammered that he had walked near Whitechapel to clear his head, after an argument with his uncle over money. In the small sitting room, Holmes spotted a leather tool roll half hidden under a chair, containing a small chain cutter and spare links. "For repairs," Arthur insisted. Holmes tested one link against the photograph he had taken of the bruise. Close, but not identical in thickness. Arthur's pub alibi from that evening held firm when checked later by telegram. The tool suggested knowledge, but not direct guilt. The link bent, but did not break. From there we descended into Stepney to see Eliza Croft again. The tenement stairs groaned under our weight, the hallway thick with coal smoke and the smell of boiled cabbage from neighbouring rooms. Eliza appeared more composed this time, her rough apron tied tightly. Holmes asked to see her locket once more. She handed it over reluctantly. He compared the central chain motif to the fibres from the cab. Similar design, but the metal was silver, not the heavier iron of the murder weapon. Her sister confirmed she had been home sewing all evening. Neighbours had heard her singing hymns. The grudge remained, but opportunity vanished. Another weak link, her involvement shattered cleanly. Our final test of the morning took us back to Lady Eleanor Thorne's drawing room in Mayfair. The fire burned low, casting warm shadows across silk upholstery and the smooth surface of a small brandy decanter. Lady Eleanor received us with quiet dignity, though her hands trembled slightly as she poured us each a glass of the sweet liquor. Holmes gently raised the matter of the faint bruise on her wrist, noticed days earlier. She admitted it came from a too-tight bracelet during a recent fall down the stairs. Nothing sinister. When shown the telegram fragment from the cab, "Meet at Circus H," she paled but insisted she had exchanged no such messages with Hargrove. A discreet inquiry later confirmed the H matched Hargrove's hand, not hers. The romantic whispers between her and Blackwood proved a red herring, a private matter unrelated to murder. That potential link broke apart entirely. By early afternoon we returned to Hargrove's Whitechapel warehouse. The vast space echoed with the clang of chains and the shouts of dock workers. Holmes led us directly to the hoist from which a link had gone missing. He produced the small gunpowder-stained fibre from the cab vent and held it beside residue still clinging to the hoist's chain bed. The match was unmistakable. Same composition, same faint acrid scent. Hargrove, summoned from his office, grew red-faced and blustering. "Business use only," he protested. But when Holmes pointed out the telegram fragment bearing his initial and the weakened club alibi, the man's denials faltered. The physical evidence held firm. This link did not bend. We rode back to Baker Street in silence, the hansom's wheels splashing through puddles, the cold leather seats damp against our backs. Holmes stared out at the passing gas lamps, fingers steepled. Weak links have shattered. Blackwood's telegram, Eliza's chain, Lady Eleanor's bruise, Arthur's partial connection. The true chain emerges clearer. Mechanism, gunpowder, missing hoist link, Hargrove's faltering alibi, the warehouse itself, the quarry stands exposed. He turned to me with a faint smile. The reader may have tested these links alongside us. Some broke quickly, others held. How many weak ones did you spot before they fell away? The chain now points in one direction only. Outside, the fog began to thicken again as dusk approached, but inside the cab, a quiet certainty settled between us. Chapter 5. The Chain Tightens. The afternoon of the third day brought a sudden shift in the weather. The fog, which had hung so persistently over London, began to tear apart in ragged patches, allowing shafts of weak sunlight to pierce through and glint on wet cobblestones. Yet the air remained cold and damp, heavy with the mingled smells of coal smoke from 1,000 chimney, and the ever-present rot of Thames mud carried on the breeze. At 221B Baker Street, the coal fire burned low but steady, its crackle a quiet counterpoint to the tension that now filled the room. Holmes stood before the mantel, fingers steepled, studying the small collection of evidence we had gathered. The gunpowder-stained hemp fibre, the telegram scrap, the reddish clay sample, and a photograph of the bruise taken under better light. "The weak links have fallen away, Watson," he said, voice calm but edged with certainty. "What remains points unmistakably to Victor Hargrove." The chain tightens. We go to his residence in Kensington at once, before he has time to destroy what little remains of his trail. We hailed a hansom in Baker Street, and the cab's wheels clattered sharply over the drying stones, leather seats still chilled and faintly damp from morning rain. As we crossed into the more fashionable districts, the fog horns grew fainter, replaced by the distant chime of church bells and the steady trot of horses. Hargrove's house was a narrow, respectable town residence of dark brick, its windows curtained against the afternoon light. We knocked. The maid who answered paled at the sight of Holmes's card and our determined expressions. "Mr. Hargrove is not at home," she stammered. Holmes's eyes narrowed. "Then we shall wait inside. Inform him that Sherlock Holmes requires his immediate presence on a matter of murder." The maid retreated in haste. Moments later we heard hurried footsteps on the upper landing, then the slam of a back door. Holmes moved like lightning. "Oh, he flees, Watson! The side passage!" We dashed through the narrow hall, past a parlour smelling of polished wood and faint tobacco, and out into a small paved yard. Hargrove was already vaulting the low wall at the rear, his coat flapping. The chase was on. We pursued him through a maze of mews and back alleys behind Kensington, boots pounding on slick cobbles, breath clouding in the cold air. Rain began again, sharp, stinging drops that carried the scent of wet slate and distant river mud. Hargrove stumbled once, splashing through a puddle. Holmes closed the gap with long, economical strides. At last, in a dead-end courtyard behind a row of stables, Hargrove turned at bay, chest heaving, face glistening with rain and sweat. A small brazier burned in the corner, likely left by stable lads, casting a warm, a flickering glow against the bitter chill. Holmes stopped a few paces away, breathing evenly. "The chain tightens, Mr. Hargrove. There is no further escape." The merchant's eyes darted wildly. "This is madness. I've done nothing." Holmes stepped closer, voice low and inexorable. "The link, the missing hoist chain from your warehouse, its gauge and metal, matched the impression on Sir Reginald's neck, exactly. The forge. You used a simple but ingenious device. A length of that chain threaded through the cab's vent, attached to a small gunpowder charge from your own stock. The explosion, tiny, muffled, tensioned the chain with sudden force, strangling your partner in seconds before the links retracted. Locked doors, absent weapon, ghostly vanishing, all explained." Hargrove's hands clenched. "You have no proof." "I have the fibre," Holmes continued, all producing the envelope. "Gunpowder residue from your hoist bed matches that on the body. I have the telegram fragment you dropped in haste, your initial, your handwriting. I have witnesses who saw you leave your club early, contrary to your alibi. And I have the reddish clay on your boots, on the cab floor, on Arthur's cuff, yet Arthur's movements that night are accounted for elsewhere. You alone connect all three places." He paused, letting the words settle, like the rain dripping from the eaves. "I recall the affair of the Crooked Man. There a soldier, long thought dead, returned to confront his betrayer. The shock of recognition and old guilt caused the victim's heart to fail. Murder disguised as natural death. The chain was emotional. forged from past betrayal. Here the chain is mechanical. Oh, but the motive is the same. Betrayal in business. You killed Thorne to seize control of the firm and cover your embezzlement of shipments. The bind is complete. When you eliminate the impossible, ghost, suicide, outside intruder, what remains, however improbable, is your guilt. Hargrove sagged against the wall, rain streaming down his face. For a long moment, only the crackle of the brazier and the patter of rain filled the courtyard. Then, in a broken voice, he spoke. It was the debts, the imports failing. He was going to expose me. I only meant to frighten him. The charge was too strong. Holmes's expression remained impassive. A partial confession, enough for now. I stepped forward, astonished. Holmes, this is the breakthrough, the mechanism, the motive, all connected. He turned to me, a faint gleam in his eye. The reader has followed the chain with us, Watson. Many suspected Hargrove earlier. Some may still have doubted until this moment. Before I explain the final link to Scotland Yard, what did this evidence tell you when the chase began? Did you see the noose closing before Hargrove himself confessed? We waited until 2 constables arrived, summoned by a passing cabman who had witnessed the pursuit. Hargrove was led away in irons, head bowed, the clink of metal echoing off the stable walls. The chain had tightened fully. There was no escape now. Chapter 6. Links to the Past. With Victor Hargrove safely in custody at Scotland Yard, the fog that had shrouded London for days finally began to lift on the 4th morning, leaving the city damp and gleaming under a weak, watery sun. At 221B Baker Street, the coal fire burned with a steady, comforting warmth, its crackle mingling with the faint scent of strong tobacco as Holmes refilled his pipe from the Persian slipper. The room smelled also of damp newspaper and the lingering carbolic from our earlier examinations of evidence. I sipped hot tea, its bitter warmth steadying me after the intensity of the previous day's chase. Holmes stood by the window, watching hansoms pass below on Baker Street, their wheels hissing softly on the still wet cobblestones. The physical chain is forged, Watson, he said quietly. Now we must trace its origin further back, into the past of our quarry. Motive is rarely born in a single moment. It grows link by link over years. We go to the British Museum reading room, then to the Records Office in Chancery Lane. We took a cab through the bustling streets, and the leather seats cool against our backs, the air carrying the mingled smells of coal smoke from factory chimneys and fresh bread from corner bakeries. At the museum, the great domed reading room enveloped us in quiet. The rustle of turning pages, the soft tread of attendants on worn carpet, the faint musty odour of old leather bindings and aged paper. Holmes requested the commercial directories and bankruptcy filings for the past decade, his long fingers moving swiftly across the heavy tomes. Within an hour, he had uncovered the first deep link. Here, he said, tapping a faded entry from 1887, Victor Hargrove declared bankruptcy after a disastrous speculation in tea shipments from Ceylon. His principal creditor, and the man who bought up his remaining assets at auction, was none other than Sir Reginald Thorne, who Thorne did not ruin him out of malice. He simply seized opportunity. Hargrove never forgave the humiliation. He rebuilt slowly, entering partnership with Thorne 5 years later, but resentment festered. The texture of the old ledger paper was rough under my fingertips as I leaned closer. Holmes continued. Another record. In 1892, Hargrove pawned a family heirloom, a heavy gold chain with an engraved crest, to cover a debt. The pawn ticket shows it was redeemed by Sir Reginald Thorne himself, who kept it as collateral until the partnership stabilised. The chain was never returned. I recalled the tattoo on the dead man's arm, the coiled chain of the Thorne crest. So the murder weapon was symbolic as well as practical. Precisely, Holmes replied. Hargrove retrieved the chain from Thorne's study during a late business meeting, 2 nights before the crime. Lady Eleanor confirmed nothing was missing until after his death. He modified it, shortened one link, attached it to a small gunpowder charge from his warehouse stock. Revenge and greed entwined, one for past shame, the other for future control of the firm. We moved on to the records office in Chancery Lane, a narrower building where gas lamps burned even in daylight, casting long shadows across dusty shelves. The clerk brought out partnership agreements and import manifests. Holmes's eyes gleamed as he traced entries. Forged bills of lading over the past 18 months. Shipments quietly diverted and sold on the side by Hargrove. Profits pocketed, while Thorne remained unaware. And the final manifest, dated the day before the murder, showed a large silk consignment lost at sea. In truth, it had been sold through a fence Hargrove knew from his bankrupt days. The motive is complete, Holmes said as we stepped back into the street. Embezzlement discovered, exposure imminent, old humiliation revived by the sight of his own pawn chain still worn by Thorne as a watch fob. The device was born of warehouse knowledge. The act of murder was born of years of chained resentment. Back at 221B that evening, the fire burned brighter against the gathering dusk. Rain began again, drumming softly on the window panes, the fog horns on the Thames moaning in the distance like echoes of old wrongs. Holmes sat in his armchair, violin across his knees, plucking a slow, thoughtful melody that rose and fell with the crackle of coals. I poured us each a measure of sweet brandy from the tantalus. Its warmth spread pleasantly after the chill of the day. He set the violin aside and spoke reflectively. I am reminded of the 5 orange pips. There a family was bound by an ancestral chain of sin, the activities of the Ku Klux Klan in America. The pips were links of warning, passed down through generations until the final inheritor paid the price. No device was needed. The terror of the past sufficed to kill. Here, too, past and present are one unbroken chain. Hargrove's bankruptcy in 1887, linked to the pawned heirloom in 1892, linked to the partnership in 1893, linked to embezzlement discovered in 1895, linked at last to murder in Piccadilly Circus. Each event forged the next, invisible until the final link snapped tight. He leaned forward, eyes fixed on the fire. The reader has followed these links with us from the first bruise to this deep history. Some may have suspected business betrayal early. Others may only now see how far back the chain truly stretches. Before we proceed to the final accounting, what connections did you forge between Hargrove's past and the mechanism of the crime? Did the shadow of old debts reveal the killer to you sooner than it did to me? Outside, Big Ben tolled 7, its deep note muffled by the returning mist. Holmes reached once more for his pipe, drawing deeply on the strong tobacco, as though to anchor himself after delving so far into another man's shadowed history. Chapter 7. The Complete Chain. The fog returned to London on the evening of the 4th day, thicker than before, wrapping the gas lamps in soft yellow halos and carrying the sharp bite of coal smoke and Thames mud through every open window. At 221B Baker Street, the coal fire burned fiercely to combat the chill. Its crackle steady and warm against the damp cold that seeped under the door. The room smelled of strong tobacco from Holmes's pipe, the faint sweetness of brandy still lingering in the air from our earlier glasses, and the carbolic trace that clung to my coat after a brief visit to the morgue to confirm final details. Holmes had summoned the principal figures to Baker Street for 7 o'clock. Lady Eleanor Thorne arrived first, silk gown rustling softly, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. Arthur Thorne followed, sober now, his boots polished but still bearing faint traces of reddish clay. Silas Blackwood came next, sharp-featured and wary. Then Inspector Lestrade with 2 constables, their heavy boots thudding up the 17 steps. Victor Hargrove was brought last, wrists in irons flanked by officers. He sat heavily in the armchair nearest the fire, face pale in the flickering light, the rough texture of his tweed coat damp from the fog outside. Mrs. Hudson had discreetly withdrawn after bringing a tray of hot tea and bitter coffee. The steam rose in slow curls, warming the bitter air as Holmes stood before the mantel, steepled fingers under his chin, eyes gleaming with that peculiar light of finality. "Gentlemen, Lady Eleanor," he began, voice calm and precise, "tonight the chain is complete. Every link has been forged, tested, and bound. I shall lay it out, step by step, so that no shadow of doubt remains." He turned first to the physical evidence. The bruise on Sir Reginald's neck, twisted, metallic, embedded with hemp fibres and gunpowder residue. This was no hand strangling, no rope. The chain link itself, recovered from Hargrove's hoist, matches the impression exactly. Gunpowder from his warehouse stock propelled the shortened length of chain through the cab's vent slat, tensioned it with sudden force, then allowed retraction. Locked doors, absent weapon, ghostly vanishing, all explained by mechanism, not apparition. Next, the timeline. Sir Reginald left his club at 8. Hargrove left early. Witnesses confirmed 7:30, claiming illness. He reached Piccadilly by 8:15, waited in fog. The telegram fragment found in the cab, "Meet at Circus, H," is in his hand, written that afternoon, and the gasp the cabby heard occurred at 8:30. Hargrove had 10 minutes to attach the device earlier, during a stage business discussion in the cab, then vanish into the mist. He moved to the witnesses. The cabby saw only a shadow, Hargrove's silhouette in heavy ulster. No one else approached because no one else was needed. Lady Eleanor and Arthur were at home. Blackwood dined publicly. Eliza Croft sewed with her sister. Only Hargrove connects every point in time and place. The motive links came next. Bankruptcy in 1887, Thorne as creditor. Partnership in 1893. Thorne held the upper hand. Embezzlement over 18 months. Forged manifests. Diverted silks. Profits siphoned. Discovery imminent. Thorne confronted him 2 nights prior. The final insult, the family chain heirloom, pawned by Hargrove in 1892, redeemed and kept by Thorne as a symbol of dominance. Hargrove stole it back, modified it into the murder weapon, a poetic revenge as well as practical. Finally, the connecting link. In his study at Kensington, hidden beneath a loose floorboard, we found the remainder of the chain. Gunpowder residue on his fingers, and a half-burned note in his own hand. Instructions for the charge timing. The device was tested in his warehouse days earlier, hence the residue matching both hoist and body. Hargrove had remained silent. head bowed, but at this last revelation he lifted his eyes. "It was never meant to kill," he whispered hoarsely. "Only to frighten, to force him to sell his share cheaply. The charge was too strong. I panicked when he gasped. Yeah, I pulled the chain back and ran." The room fell quiet save for the fire's crackle and the distant toll of Big Ben through the fog. Lady Eleanor pressed a handkerchief to her lips. Arthur stared at the floor. Blackwood exhaled slowly, as though a weight had lifted. Lestrade nodded grimly to his men. Holmes stepped closer to Hargrove. "You have confessed. The chain binds you completely. No weak link remains. Every observation, every deduction, every past shadow of debt and greed has been accounted for." He turned to the rest of us, voice softening slightly. "The reader has followed this chain from the first bruise in Piccadilly to this final accounting in Baker Street. Many suspected Hargrove when the mechanism was revealed. Some may have seen the motive earlier when the past bankruptcy surfaced. Before the irons close finally, what final link did you forge that sealed the case in your own mind? Did the shadow of old debts and stolen heirlooms reveal the truth to you as clearly as it did to me?" Lestrade rose. "Victor Hargrove, I arrest you for the wilful murder of Sir Reginald Thorne." The constables stepped forward. The irons clinked coldly as they secured him more firmly. Hargrove made no resistance, only bowed his head again as they led him down the 17 steps. The front door closed with a heavy thud, muffled by the fog outside. Lady Eleanor stood, voice trembling but composed. "Thank you, Mr. Holmes. The nightmare ends." Arthur murmured agreement. Blackwood offered a curt nod of respect before departing. When the room was ours again, Holmes sank into his chair, drew deeply on his pipe, and let the strong tobacco smoke curl upward. The fire crackled on, warm against the bitter night. Every link accounted for, the chain complete. Chapter 8. Justice in Chains. The fog that had returned so thickly to London on the evening of Hargrove's confession lingered into the following morning, turning the gas lamps along Baker Street into blurred halos of yellow and muffling every sound save the occasional clatter of a hansom cab on wet cobblestones. At 221B, the coal fire still burned, though lower now, its warmth battling the damp chill that seeped through the window frames, and carried with it the sharp smell of coal smoke, mingled with the faint rot of Thames mud blown inland on the night breeze. I had scarcely slept. The events of the previous night replayed in my mind. The clink of irons, Hargrove's broken whisper, the quiet departure of Lady Eleanor and the others down the 17 steps. Holmes, by contrast, appeared rested and composed. He stood by the mantel in his dressing gown, pipe in hand, the strong tobacco curling upward as he reviewed a fresh telegram from Lestrade. "The warrant is signed," he said quietly. "Hargrove remains at Scotland Yard overnight cells. We accompany Lestrade to the warehouse this morning for the formal arrest and search. Justice, Watson, must be seen to be served, not merely deduced." We descended to the street and took a hansom to Whitechapel. The journey was slow. Foghorns moaned from the river, rain pattered steadily on the cab roof, and the leather seats were cold and slightly sticky against our backs. The warehouse loomed through the mist like a great brick beast, its tall doors standing open, the interior lit by hanging lanterns that cast long shadows across stacked crates and dangling chain hoists. A dozen constables waited under Lestrade's direction, their capes glistening, boots leaving muddy prints on the stone floor. Hargrove was brought forward in irons, still wearing the same rough tweed coat from the night before, now creased and damp. His face was ashen, eyes hollow in the lantern light. When he saw Holmes, he stopped short, the chains clinking softly. Lestrade stepped up, voice formal and clipped. "Victor Hargrove, you are charged with the wilful murder of Sir Reginald Thorne by means of a mechanical strangulation device on the evening of October the 15th, 1895. You will be taken from this place to stand trial at the Old Bailey." Hargrove's gaze darted from Lestrade to Holmes, then to the chain hoist overhead, the very one from which the fatal link had been taken. For a moment he seemed about to speak. Then his shoulders sagged, and a low, bitter laugh escaped him. "I built my life link by link after the bankruptcy," he said hoarsely, voice echoing off the rafters. "Thorne snapped the first one when he took everything I had left. I thought partnership would mend it, restore my name, my pride. Instead, he held the chain tighter every year. The heirloom, that damned gold chain, he wore it like a trophy. When he threatened to expose the diverted shipments, I saw no other way. The gunpowder was only to scare him into selling his share. I never meant the charge to be so strong. When he gasped, when the chain pulled tight, his voice cracked. I ran. I thought the fog would hide me, like a ghost. But you, Holmes, you saw every link I tried to hide." He looked directly at Holmes now, eyes burning with a mixture of hatred and strange relief. "You forged the chain that binds me. I underestimated the power of observation. May it comfort you when another case comes." Holmes regarded him impassively. "It was not observation alone, Hargrove. It was the refusal to accept the impossible. Ghosts do not leave gunpowder residue or reddish clay from Whitechapel foundries. Human hands do." Lestrade gave a curt nod. The constables moved forward. Hargrove made no resistance as they led him toward the waiting Black Maria outside. The irons clinked rhythmically with each step, a grim counterpoint to the patter of rain on the warehouse roof and the distant shout of a dock worker. As the van doors closed, Hargrove cast one last look back, not at Holmes, but at the chain hoist, swaying gently in the draught. Then he was gone. We remained to oversee the search. In Hargrove's office, behind a false panel in the wall, constables discovered a small iron box containing the remaining length of the modified chain, several unused gunpowder packets, and a ledger of falsified manifests. The stolen Thorne heirloom, shortened but unmistakable, was recovered from a locked drawer. Its heavy gold links gleamed dully in the lantern light. Lady Eleanor would have it returned that afternoon. Lestrade wiped rain from his bowler and clapped Holmes on the shoulder. "Another one for the records, Mr. Holmes. Scotland Yard owes you a debt. Again, the press will call it the Ghost of Piccadilly vanquished by logic. But between us, it was the chain of evidence that did it. Link by solid link." Holmes inclined his head. "Credit where it is due, Lestrade. Your men secured the scene swiftly. Without that, fibres and residue might have been lost. The Yard's thoroughness complemented the deduction. We left the warehouse as the fog began to thin once more, shafts of pale sunlight breaking through to glitter on wet cobblestones. The air felt lighter, though still cold and damp. Back at 221B, the fire had been built up anew. Mrs. Hudson brought fresh tea, its steam rising warmly. I poured brandy for us both, the sweet burn steadying my nerves after the morning's grim duty. Holmes settled into his chair, pipe drawing thoughtfully. "Loose ends are tied, Watson. The heirloom restored, the embezzlement exposed, innocence cleared of suspicion. Hargrove's confession seals what evidence had already bound." Justice, though slow and cold as these irons, ish has been served. He paused, eyes on the fire. The reader has watched the chain draw tight, from bruise to confession to arrest. Some may have foreseen this ending when the warehouse residue matched, others when the past debts surfaced. Did the final clink of irons bring you the same quiet satisfaction it brings me now? Outside, Big Ben told noon, its note clearer in the lifting fog. The city moved on, as it always did. Chapter 9. Links restored. The days following Victor Hargrove's arrest passed in a quiet, methodical procession through the machinery of justice. As the fog of London slowly gave way to clearer skies and the sharp bite of early winter air. At 221 B. Baker Street, the coal fire burned steadily each morning, its crackle a comforting constant against the chill that now nipped at the window pane and carried the faint smell of frost-kissed Thames mud up from the river. The room still held traces of strong tobacco from Holmes's pipe, and the lingering carbolic from the evidence we had handled. But a new sense of order had settled over the space like a well-pressed tablecloth. The trial at the Old Bailey began on a crisp November morning, 10 days after the warehouse arrest. The courtroom smelled of polished oak, old paper, and the carbolic soap used to scrub the floors nightly. Gas lamps burned low against the high windows, casting long shadows across the benches where spectators sat in hushed rows. I took my place in the gallery beside Lady Eleanor Thorne, whose silk morning dress rustled softly as she clasped her gloved hands. Arthur Thorne sat a row behind, soberly dressed, his once scuffed boots now polished to a quiet gleam. Silas Blackwood occupied a seat near the front, his sharp features composed but watchful. Hargrove entered the dock in irons, head bowed, the clink of metal echoing faintly against the high ceiling. His counsel, a thin, nervous man in black, pleaded diminished responsibility and accidental overcharge of the device, but the evidence was overwhelming. The recovered chain, the gunpowder packets, the falsified ledgers, the half-burnt note of instructions, and Hargrove's own confession in the presence of Holmes and Lestrade. The judge, wigged and grave, listened without interruption as the prosecution laid out the chain of proof link by link. Bruise, mechanism, timeline, motive, past debts, all forged into an unbreakable whole. Yet after 3 days of testimony, the verdict came swiftly. Guilty of willful murder. Sentence was pronounced, death by hanging. Though whispers in the corridors suggested a possible commutation to life imprisonment on grounds of the device's original intent to frighten rather than kill. Hargrove accepted the judgment in silence, only lifting his eyes once to meet Holmes's steady gaze from the witness bench. No final outburst, no plea for mercy. The chain had bound him too tightly for that. With the trial concluded, the innocent parties found themselves gradually freed from suspicion's shadow. Lady Eleanor received the restored Thorne family heirloom, a heavy gold chain with the coiled crest, delivered to her Mayfair residence by a solemn clerk from Scotland Yard. She held it in trembling hands before the drawing-room fire, its links warm from the flames stitches, and murmured thanks to Holmes in a letter that arrived the next day. The chain that once symbolized loss now reminds me of restored trust. My husband's memory is cleared of any taint of suicide or scandal. Arthur Thorne, whose debts had cast fleeting doubt, emerged transformed. Freed from the pressure of his uncle's expectations and the shadow of suspicion, he took a modest position in a city counting-house under Blackwood's recommendation. The two men, once rivals in business, now shared a quiet understanding. Blackwood's own alibi and lack of motive had been thoroughly vindicated, and he extended a hand of partnership to Arthur. "Debts can be paid in time," Blackwood told him over brandy one evening. "Reputations are harder to mend." Arthur accepted, and reports reached us that he was applying himself diligently. The reddish clay of Whitechapel foundries no longer staining his boots. Eliza Croft, the dismissed housemaid whose locket had briefly seemed a damning link, received a letter of reference from Lady Eleanor, and a small sum to ease her transition. She found new employment in a respectable household in Kensington, where her steady hands and quiet manner were valued. The chain motif on her locket, once a source of unease, became merely a family keepsake again, worn without fear. London itself seemed to breathe more easily as the case faded from the newspapers. The fog, though still present on winter mornings, no longer carried the weight of ghostly whispers in Piccadilly Circus. Hansom cabs rattled along the streets with their usual brisk rhythm, gas lamps flickered reliably at dusk, and the distant toll of Big Ben marked the hours without the undercurrent of dread. The vendors near the circus fountain resumed their calls of hot chestnuts and newspapers, the smell of roasted nuts mingling once more with coal smoke and damp wool rather than suspicion. At 221B that evening, Holmes and I sat before the fire. Mrs. Hudson had brought up fresh tea and a plate of buttered toast. The steam rose warmly, cutting the chill that lingered in the corners. Holmes drew thoughtfully on his pipe, the strong tobacco curling upward in slow spirals. "Order is restored, Watson," he said quietly. "The chain that bound a killer has been broken and reforged into links of justice. Evidence preserved, innocence cleared, future paths opened. Hargrove's shadow no longer darkens Piccadilly, and the city moves forward as it always does, link by ordinary link." He paused, eyes on the flames. The reader has watched this restoration unfold, from the first forged link in the bruise to the final clink of irons and the quiet return of normal life. Some may have doubted the innocence early. Others may have seen their exoneration coming when the true chain pointed elsewhere. Did the lifting of suspicion from Lady Eleanor, Arthur and Eliza bring you the same sense of quiet balance it brings me now? Outside, the foghorns on the Thames sounded softer, almost soothing, as the great city settled into its familiar rhythm once more. Chapter 10. By the Fire at Baker Street. Several weeks had passed since the conclusion of the Piccadilly ghost affair, and London had settled once more into its familiar winter rhythm, and the fog still drifted through the streets on cold evenings, but it no longer carried the weight of suspicion or the whisper of ghostly chains. At 221B Baker Street, the coal fire burned with a steady, golden warmth, its crackle filling the room like a quiet companion. The air smelled pleasantly of strong tobacco from Holmes's pipe, the faint sweetness of brandy in our glasses, and the clean, woody scent of fresh kindling Mrs. Hudson had just brought up. Outside, the distant toll of Big Ben marked the hour, muffled softly by the mist that pressed against the window-panes. Holmes sat in his usual armchair, legs stretched toward the hearth, violin resting across his knees. He had been playing a slow, meditative air, something from Bach, I think, when he set the instrument aside and reached for his pipe. I occupied the opposite chair, as a copy of the evening paper folded on my lap. The headlines had moved on to other matters: a railway expansion in the Midlands, a diplomatic note from Berlin, the usual petty crimes of the metropolis. The Piccadilly case had faded from public view, as such sensations always do. "Another quiet evening, Watson," Holmes remarked, drawing thoughtfully on the pipe. "No urgent knocks, no frantic telegrams. The city breathes easier." I nodded, sipping the brandy. Its sweet warmth spread pleasantly through my chest. "The papers still mention you occasionally. The man who banished the Ghost of Piccadilly. But they've shortened it to a footnote now." Holmes gave a small, dry smile. "As it should be. The work is done, the chain complete. Let us review it once more, if only for the satisfaction of seeing every link in place." He leaned back. He steepled his fingers beneath his chin and began the familiar litany. Not for my benefit alone, but as though addressing an invisible audience beyond the firelight. "The method is always the same, Watson, though each case forges its chain differently. Observation supplies the raw links. A bruise shaped like twisted metal, hemp fibres with gunpowder residue, reddish clay mud on boots, a bent vent slat in a locked cab. Deduction forges the connections. The bruise demands mechanical pressure, not human hands. The gunpowder points to a time charge from a warehouse. The mud traces paths between foundry, docks, and crime scene. The vent reveals how the impossible was made possible. Link by link, the impossible is eliminated until only the truth remains." He paused, eyes on the flames. "I am often asked, by correspondence, by young men ambitious in the science, how the chain holds so firmly. The answer lies in parallel cases, in the accumulation of precedent. Consider the hound of the Baskervilles. There a spectral hound terrorized a family, its glowing jaws and unearthly howls driving men to death or madness. Superstition explained everything until we examined the physical traces. Phosphorus paint on the beast's muzzle, a hidden boot print in soft earth, the legend itself rooted in a 17th century forgery designed to conceal a crime. The chain broke when observation revealed the hound was no ghost, but a trained animal smeared with chemical light, deception defeated by science, fear dispelled by fact. Just so here. The Ghost of Piccadilly was no apparition, but a man using warehouse tools and old grudges to create the illusion of impossibility. The vent, and the charge, the retracted chain, all mechanical, all traceable. Observation defeats deception because the world leaves marks. The cleverest criminal cannot erase every trace." Holmes drew again on his pipe, the smoke curling upward in lazy spirals. "The science of deduction is not magic, Watson. It is patient accumulation. One link seems trivial, a speck of clay, a whiff of gunpowder, until it connects to another and another, until the chain binds so tightly that no escape remains. Hargrove forgot that ground remembers footsteps, that metal leaves impressions, that paper retains ink even when damp. He built a perfect crime in theory. We built a perfect chain in reality." He turned his gaze toward me, a faint gleam in his eye. "You have recorded these events faithfully, old friend, as from the first knock at our door to the clink of irons at the warehouse, from confusion to clarity, from suspicion to exoneration. The transformations are complete. The criminal hidden, then suspected, then chained, then caught. The innocents accused, then suffering, then freed by logic. The mystery baffling, then threaded with links, then made whole. Myself from bored to energized, to triumphant, to now merely satisfied. And you, Watson, from puzzled observer to attentive student, to admiring chronicler to quiet recorder of the truth." He set the pipe aside and lifted his glass in a small salute. "To the next puzzle, whenever it comes, Razai, and to those who read these pages, forge your own chains of logic. Question the impossible, examine the overlooked, connect the scattered. The world is full of half-seen links waiting to be joined. And when you eliminate the impossible, what remains, however improbable, is the truth. The fire crackled softly, the brandy glowed amber in the glass, and for a long moment neither of us spoke. Outside, a hansom cab rattled past, its wheels hissing on damp cobblestones. Somewhere, a foghorn moaned once, then fell silent. London continued its endless turning. Holmes picked up the violin again, fingers brushing the strings absently. Until the next chain forges, dear listener, the game continues.